Welcome back to Ma'am Astrid's classroom, especially to you, future educators. In today's video, we shall talk about developing a scoring rubric, as this is one of your major requirements in the course. No? You have to know how to develop a scoring rubric. After learning about authentic or non-authentic traditional assessment, we need to learn about the hows and the whys of making a scoring rubric. Remember that the alternate response, multiple choice, and completion type of traditional assessment do not require scoring rubric because they have definite correct answers, and all the teacher needs to do is to check if the given answer is correct or wrong. Of course, essay needs a scoring rubric. So, this will be the focus of today's lesson. But before moving on, be mindful of the following learning objectives. Number 1, explain what is a scoring rubric. Cite the parts of a scoring rubric. Next one, distinguish between holistic and analytic rubrics and between general and task-specific rubric. Next one, cite the importance of scoring rubric. Construct a holistic and analytic rubric based on a given learning outcome, competency, and distinguish among the scoring rubric, checklist, and rating scale. Okay. What is a scoring rubric? Let us look into some of the important definitions from different scholars and different sources. According to Brookhart in 2013, a scoring rubric is a coherent set of criteria for a student's work that includes description of levels of performance, quality on the criteria. Next one, a scoring guide that uses criteria to differentiate between levels of students' proficiency, that is from Macmillan in 2007. While according to Popham in 2011, it is the scoring procedures for judging students' responses to what? To performing tests. In short, a scoring rubric is a scoring guide used to assess performing or performance against a set of criteria. Okay. Scoring rubrics are typically employed when a judgment of quality is required and may be used to evaluate a broad range of subjects and activities. For instance, we will use scoring rubric in grading essays or in evaluating projects such as scrapbooks and so forth. Judgment concerning the quality of a given writing may vary depending upon the established criteria. Let us take a speech for example. One evaluator may heavily weigh the evaluation process upon the linguistic structure, while another may give emphasis on the persuasiveness of the argument. So, magkakaiba yan. It depends on the evaluator. That is why, as a teacher, you have to prepare a good scoring rubric to evaluate these activities. So, by developing a predefined scheme of evaluation process, the subjectivity involved in evaluating becomes more objective. Okay. Now, let us look into the parts of a scoring rubric. Scoring rubric has two major parts. We have the criteria and the description of the levels of performance. Let us look into the following example. This is an example of a recitation rubric or a scoring rubric used in rating a recitation. This recitation rubric has 4 criteria. So, this is the criteria. This part is the criteria. No? So, number of appropriate hand gestures, appropriate facial expression, voice inflection, and incorporate proper ambience through feelings in the voice. These are the given criteria. And then, it has 3 levels of performance. describe specifically for every criterion of performance. The second column is the weight per criterion. This one. This is the weight per criterion. Among these four criteria, incorporating proper ambience through feelings in the voice has the greatest weight. O, diba? Mas malaki ito yung pinakamalaki ng weight kasi times 4 siya. So, students can receive what? 3, 6, or 9 times 4 diba? Whichever is most appropriate for the students in the criterion. Okay. The recitation rubric contains what you call the descriptors. Also, these are this part here is the level of performance. Okay? Parang 1, 2, 3. Okay. This one, in this part here is called the descriptors. Also, a common component of the rubric. It's very important part of the rubric because descriptors spell out what is expected of students at each level of performance for each criterion. So, kailan ka makakakuha ng times 2, 1 dito, sa appropriate facial expression na ano nito nakalagay dito na describe, sabi niya lots of appropriate facial expression, dito naman few inappropriate facial expression, and here no apparent appropriate facial expression. So if you are judging, alam mo na kung sa anong ilalagay mong ratings because meron siyang descriptor or it's the specific description of the level of performance plus the criteria. Okay. So, in this recitation rubric, lots of inappropriate facial expression, monotone use, and recitation fully captures ambience through feelings in the voice are examples of descriptors. So, this one. Okay? Now, why are descriptors important? Bakit kailangan nating lagyan ng descriptors yung ating scoring rubric? Descriptors tells students more precisely what performance looks like at each level and how their work may be distinguished from the works of others per criterion. Similarly, these descriptors help the teacher more precisely and consistently distinguish between students' work. Okay. Now, next question would be, why include the level of performance? Ba't kailangan nating lagyan ito ng level of performance? Okay. Number 1 is for clearer expectation. It is very useful for the students and the teacher if the criteria are identified and communicated prior to completion of the task. So remember, you have to explain to the students the content of your scoring rubrics if you are giving them an activity so that they will know what to prepare, how to prepare, and when to prepare. Okay? Which is the highest in weight. Ano? Asan ang pinakamabigat na criteria mo? Asan ang hindi kinakailangan? Kasi baka naghahanda sila tapos they put some things na hindi naman nagregradan or nabibigyan ng score. Okay? So, students know what is expected of them and teachers know what to look for in students' performance. Similarly, students better understand what good or bad performance on a task look like if the levels of performance are identified, particularly if descriptors for each level are included. Another reason is more consistent and objective assessment. In addition to better communicating teacher expectations, level of performance permit the teacher to more consistently and objectively distinguish between good and bad performance. Or, maybe we can say between superior, mediocre, or poor performance when evaluating students' work. And lastly, of course, for better feedback, it's very important. Identifying specific levels of a student's performance allows the teacher to provide more detailed feedbacks to students. The teachers and the students can more clearly recognize areas that needs improvement. So, basing on the scoring rubrics that you prepare and then watching the performance example, it's a dance, then you can easily recognize and you can clearly recognize the areas that needs improvement. Okay. Now, let us talk about Analytic versus holistic rubrics. An analytic rubric articulates level of performance of each criterion. The recitation rubric I showed a while back is an example of this kind of rubric. Using the recitation rubric, a teacher could assess whether a student has done a poor, good, or excellent job in creating the ambience and distinguish what form or they distinguish that from how well the student did it on voice inflection. When to choose an analytic rubric then? It is more common because teachers typically want to assess each criterion separately, particularly for activities that involves a larger number of criteria. So if we say analytic rubric, teachers uses this more commonly because it assesses each criterion separately. Katulad nga nung example natin kanina, the rubric used in recitation. Now, what is a holistic rubric then? It assigns a level of performance by assessing performance across multiple criteria as a whole. It is used when quick or gross judgment needs to be made. If the assessment is a minor one, such as a brief homework assignment to quickly review and view a student's work. So, again, in short, analytic rubrics identify and assess components of a finished product. Okay? While holistic rubric assess students' work as a whole. So, in here, we do not need again to debate on which of the two is a better type because it is up to you as a teacher to choose on which is you are going to use, depending of course on what type of activity or output you are going to assess. Okay. Another question about making a rubric is, how many levels of performance should I include in a rubric? Ilang level of performance ba kailangan bang? 5, 4, 3? Okay. So, there is no specific number of levels of performance, no, in a rubric or a rubric should possess. It will always vary depending on the task and the need. A rubric can have a few, pwedeng 2 lang, okay, or as many as you decide, okay, for as long as these levels are appropriate and needed in assessing a performance or a product. Again, it depends upon you as a teacher and it depends upon the situation and on what activity you are going to grade or rate. Generally, we start at a smaller number of levels of performance for a criterion and then we expand it if it is necessary. As the number of levels increases, and those judgments become finer and finer, the likelihood the error increases. So, this is the reason why we should start small. Okay, maybe we could make use of 3 levels of performance. Okay. Example is grading an oral presentation and thus designing an oral presentation rubric. One criterion that you might need to consider is the amount of eye contact with the audience. So, look at this one. Okay. You are making a rubric you are going to use in an oral presentation. So, one criterion may be this one. Makes eye contact with the audience. Okay? In this criterion, you may wish to judge it with 3 levels. So, this is what you call the levels of performance. Okay, so you may opt to use 3 as a beginner, no? Never, sometimes, and always. Okay, so makes eye contact. So, one student nung nag-present siya, kasi ang ginajudge mo is the eye contact. When he never looked at the audience and he just looked at his copy, so you rate it as never. But if sometimes he looks at the audience, you rate him here. Or if he has a good eye contact with the audience, you may put always. Okay, so 3, mas madali yan na gamitin. Okay. But if you think these 3 levels cannot capture all the variations in the student's performance on this criterion, if feeling mo hindi ito sapat, okay, that this is insufficient, and after applying such rubric and discover that you cannot effectively discriminate among the student's performance with just 3 levels, then you might opt to add the levels. Okay, pwede mong dagdagan, so magiging ganyan na siya. So you may add rarely and usually to make it 5 levels. Remember, there is no right answers as to how many levels of performance there should be for a criterion in an analytic rubric. That will depend on the nature of the task assigned, the criteria being evaluated, the students involved, and your purpose of preferences. For example, okay, another teacher might decide to leave off the always level in the above rubric because usually is as much as normally can be expected or even wanted in some instances. So, magiging ganyan ulit siya. You're going to make it fewer, no? So again, you may change the level and make it 4 because you think that it might be more workable. So, when you added these 5 levels, you come to the realization na, oh, masyadong madami. Okay? So, I might as well remove 1. Okay? So, you opted to remove 1 to become 4. Okay? Because you think that these 4 levels of performance is more workable than having 5 or having 3. So, personally, I recommend that fewer level of performance be included initially, no? So, you start with fewer level of performance, like 3. Okay. Why? Why do I recommend this? Of course, it is easier and quicker to administer, easier to explain to students, and easier to expand than larger rubrics to shrink. As I've been telling a while back, if you start it with fewer levels of performance, then you can always add. Okay? Compare if you started with many levels of performances, you don't even know what to shrink, what to remove from the level of performance. Okay, so start fewer so that, I repeat, it is easier and quicker to administer, it is easier to explain to students, and it is easier to expand than larger rubrics to shrink. Okay. Let us talk about the desired characteristics of criteria for classroom rubrics. Okay. In developing or in selecting a rubric, the first question we ask is that, what are the good criteria of a good performance or product that the rubric ought to assess? The criteria should be the most important aspects of quality work as described in the learning outcome and not characteristics of the performance or product task itself. So the following are the desired characteristics of criteria for classroom rubrics. Number 1. One among the characteristics is being appropriate. Appropriate? What's the meaning of this? Each criterion represents an aspect of standards, curricular goal, or instructional goal, or objective that students are intended to learn. Remember that in preparing a lesson, in preparing activities, you always start with goals and objectives. So be sure that the rubric that you are making, the criterion, should represent that standard, which is a weapon in the goals and the objectives of the students, no? Whatever the objectives the students intend to learn, we should provide it from the start, from the beginning, no? From planning the lesson, planning the activities, and of course, in designing your scoring rubrics. Next characteristics of a criteria should be definable. The criteria that you are making or using should be definable. Each criterion has clear, agreed upon meaning that both students and teacher understands. So that is why I always say that in preparing a scoring rubric, you should present it to the students first before you're going to use it, so that they understand and they know how to expect. And same through with you. You know how to expect from your students. Next one, observable. Each criterion describes quality in the performance that can be perceived, seen, or heard by someone other than the person performing. So, observable. Next, distinct from one another. Each criterion identifies as a separate aspect of the learning outcomes the performance is intended to assess. Next characteristics should be complete. All the criteria together describe the whole of the learning outcomes the performance is intended to assess. And the last one, criteria should be able to support descriptions along a continuum of quality, meaning each criterion can be described over a range of performance levels. So, in making your criteria in your scoring rubric, always remember to have all of this. Okay. Let's move on to the process of developing a scoring rubric. We can summarize, of course, the process into 2 steps. 1, identify the appropriate criteria to assess. The first step, of course, entails the identification of the qualities and attributes that the teachers wishes to observe in the student's output that would demonstrate their level of proficiency. So, this is according to Brookhart in 1999. These qualities and attributes form the top level of the scoring criteria for the rubrics. Once done, a decision has to be made whether a holistic or an analytical rubric would be more appropriate. In an analytic scoring rubric, each criterion is considered one by one, and the descriptions of the scoring levels are made separately. This will then result in separate descriptive scoring scheme for each of the criterion or scoring factor. On the other hand, for holistic scoring rubrics, the collection of criteria is considered throughout the construction of each level of scoring rubric, and the result is single descriptive scoring scheme. So, mas general kasi sinasabi natin yung holistic scoring rubric, while the analytic scoring rubric, you are going to present each criterion, no? May mga criteria siya, lalagyan mo siya ng scoring, descriptive scoring scheme, etc., etc. Okay. So, next would be, for each criterion, formulate the description of performance along the continuum of quality. This means that after defining the criteria for the top level of performance is the identification and definition of criteria for the lowest level of performance. So, in other words, you are asked to determine the type of performance that would constitute the worst performance, or a performance which would indicate lack of understanding of the concepts being measured. Note that each category should be defined using descriptors of the work rather than value judgment about the work. Okay, example. Student sentences, let us look into this example. Student sentences contain no errors in subject-verbal agreements. Okay. Rather than saying, students' sentences are good. Okay, so sabi rito, this phrase here, student sentences contains no error in subject-verb agreement. So, you better use this one other than using this phrase, student sentences are good. Why? The phrase, are good, where is it? The phrase, this one, are good, this, requires the evaluator to make a judgment, whereas the phrase, no errors, is quantifiable. So, this word here, the word no errors, makes this statement quantifiable. Okay, so, again, it's up to you to decide the rubric that you will gonna use. However, you must remember that you teach to the individual and not to the curriculum. So, Always consider your students in every move that you make, from the designing of your lesson until the designing of your scoring rubric. So, consider your students in every move, okay? In line with the teaching and learning process. So, it's the same when you are designing a scoring rubric. I hope that you learned something from me today. You may reach me from the following platforms. I have put here again my our FB account, our IG account, the Twitter account, and of course our YouTube account. I'll see you next time. Tandaan na sa ating classroom, okay, lahat ay matututo kahit magkakalayo. Thank you so much, guys. I'll see you next video. Bye. Ingat kayo.